Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. My guest for this episode is Mariann Hardey, who is an Associate Professor of Advanced Research Computing at the University of Durham in the northeast of England. I met Mariann during an online seminar which is part of a series called Diverse. The series is organized by Jeremy Cohen and Roland Mosbergen, and it looks at diversity, equity and inclusion in the community of research software engineers. Mariann presented her research on the role of women in modern-day technology companies, which is also the subject of her book, The Culture of Women in Tech, which she published in 2020, and which indeed is the title of this episode. Diversity and inclusion gets talked about a lot today, whether it's increasing the number of people from different backgrounds in the workplace or making the office a safer and more welcoming place. And yet, it seems that the needle hasn't moved much, and the demographics in the tech sector remains pretty much the same as it has been over a number of years. Why this isn't a good state for organizations to be in has been shown in surveys and research, and Mariann mentioned that in the seminar. And in this context, I also remember the keynote Marianne Leong, founder and CEO of the Sustainable Horizon Institute in the US, gave at the US RSE conference in Chicago in October 2023. There's a shortage of engineers left, right and center. So why on earth are we not opening the doors wider to people from different backgrounds? People who want to work as engineers and scientists. Because that barrier still exists is something Mariann made quite clear in her book, the seminar I went to, and in the conversation you're about to hear now. Hello Mariann, welcome to the show. Before we start talking about Women in Tech, which is the book that you've written, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Mariann Hardey, or Maz Hardey. I'm based at Durham University, so I'm a professor in their business school. I'm a social scientist by training, so a sociologist. I'm also part of the Advanced Research Computing Group at the university as well. I'm kind of a long-term tech fan, tech nerd, tech geek, if those labels are now allowed.
So, the Advanced Research Computing Group, what do you do there, if I may ask?
I'm part of the team there that leads on research software engineers, giving support to researchers and academics across the university. So if they want to do kind of computational stuff, for want of a better word, within their research, within the scope of a large grant, or even putting together, a large center, either in an advisory capacity or kind of a direct computational support role, that's kind of their role. And my remit within that team is ensuring that we're widening participation and making those resources as accessible as possible. And part of that is looking into issues of inclusivity, but also equity around technology. And that just happens to be my research area as well. So I'm pretty happy with that role.
It's a happy marriage, that
it
one.
Is.
Okay. Which brings us to the book that you've written, and I alluded to that earlier. It's called The Culture of Women in Tech. And what actually led you to write that?
Ooh, lots of things led me to write that book. I think the main one actually was that I wanted to be a woman in tech and found that there were so many barriers and doors to get through. I was doing that unsuccessfully. So just to give a quick example, in college, I wanted to do computing. And I was doing my A-levels at the time, and you could do an optional commuting course, which I went in for. And I was told that course wasn't available to me, but I could take on a secretarial touch typing course, which would get me into the computer lab and using the computers. The reason I wasn't allowed to take that course, drum roll please, is because I was the only girl that had signed up. And the module lead at the time advised me that perhaps, what I really wanted to do was to use the computer in a kind of a more sort of discreet feminine way, which would be, so I can do a brilliant typeface letter for you. I know how to format that like a pro. And don't get me wrong, touch typing has been an amazing life skill, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And then going into university, similarly, I wanted to join some of the computing groups, just some of the social clubs that were there and around university. I wasn't doing a major computational degree because I'd kind of been put off at my A-levels, so I ended up doing literature. But I'd always been interested in computers. My dad was a kind of a long-time tech geek. We always had computers lying around the house and he was teaching me how to code and things at home.
You kind of grew up with it.
I kind of grew up with that, yeah. And then kind of a story of woe, really. So each time I tried to put my foot forward to do something computational, I was either sort of sidelined or sort of told, is this really for you? You don't really want to be doing that, do you? And then When I started doing my postgraduate studies, my PhD at university, I started researching online news groups or newsnet rooms as they were at the time, sort of email chat forums, basically. And then out of that spun social media as we know it today. So I was kind of one of the first to be researching that area and that domain. That made it a lot more accessible for everyone. And in doing so, I was able to fall in with some really good tech communities. So one, Girl Geek dinners, but also regional tech communities in the northeast of England. So based in Leeds and those kinds of cities. And that started sort of networks of support and my interest in those kinds of networks of support for other women, either working in tech, in technical roles, but also women in tech includes women who work for tech organizations who may work as administrators or receptionists or marketing or those kinds of things. They are still women in tech.
Yeah, I think we come to that a little bit later, if I may interject there, because I think very often it gets drowned in the statistics of women in tech.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks very much for the great introduction and also the rather weird introduction. I'm amazed. And it's a little bit insidious, really, to tell you, oh, well, you really want to do something else, when in actual fact, you made it very clear that you actually do want to do that. Clearly, there is still a lot of catch-up to do. I'm looking at the Stack Overflow survey. So Stack Overflow is one of the big sites that a lot of developers use worldwide. And they run an annual survey for quite some time, where until this year, interestingly, they also provided some demographics, how many women are responding and identifying themselves as women, etc. And the number are really depressingly low in the developer community and in the project management and team lead community. So it's well over 90% in 2022 that are male, and most of them are white and under the age of 35.
Sure.
So it hasn't really changed very much, has it?
It hasn't, unfortunately. I think what tech company and organizations are getting better at is sharing their data, but it feels like that they're going through the motions of what should be quite a significant work culture revolution, work culture change, work cultural shift, however you want to frame it. Not only in discourse in terms of the labels that we use to identify ourselves and also others, but fundamentally the equitable working conditions under which workers want to work. And yes, the book is called The Culture of Women in Tech, but also within that book, I talk about equitable working conditions for everyone. For example, working parents, so paternity leave rights for fathers is a really good example, and how that isn't necessarily equal to the same status of women who would be in a similar position, becoming parents for the first time or the second time or whatever. It's good that we have the data. The data sort of speaks for itself. So we've got some really good reports, coming out of McKinsey, but also the Fortune 500 companies in terms of the proportion of kind of women involved at the board level and very senior positions, and the kind of the run profitability of those companies. And all the stats tell us that kind of diversity within the workforce, particularly within leadership positions and leader management decision-making positions, means that, you have a better, more profitable organization. Now, if that is what the stats are telling us, why are the mechanisms for change so slow? What is kind of being hidden behind the intent there? So I have a lot of conversations with tech organizations where they sort of flap their arms around a bit and sort of, this women in tech problem it's awful, isn't it? I mean, the pipeline, it's all the leaky pipeline, or there aren't enough. It must be education. It must be within the school system. When you talk through, the opportunities within the workforce, within the organizations about what they're actually doing to support existing workers so they don't lose the current workforce, but also to promote that existing workforce. Then you talk through, how they're putting together just something as simple as a job advert and what the conditions of that interview will be. You can see that there's still a lot of changes that need to happen beyond pointing the fingers at what might or might not be a leaky pipeline.
I think that's quite an interesting thing that you're saying there, like, for instance, job descriptions and how we can create environments and interviews. I mean, interviews themselves are quite intimidating anyway.
Sure.
So no matter where you come from or what your gender is, but I think it seems to be particularly encouraging certain demographics. Is that what you're saying? That we are putting out a job ad for, say, a web developer or an infrastructure engineer?
Sure.
What is it that actually, when women read that or when minorities read that stops them from applying? And what kind of conditions do they find hard to deal with?
Sure. I think there's lots
in the interview.
Yeah, there's lots of intersecting things. One major thing is that if the job description is simply too long or has too many categories, or there's too many bullet points to index the key roles and responsibilities. So what you create there is sort of an amplification of sort of imposter syndrome, which is quite common within different demographics and different communities who are underrepresented in tech organizations. So take women, for example. They will look at a job role and description. If they don't fit those kinds of categories in terms of experience or background, even to the tune of 80%, they just won't apply. It's not worth their time. Lots of reasons for that. One is imposter syndrome. One is that they don't see how they will fit into sort of an organization or company that sort of has those requirements made of them. And the other is that often it's women that hold the bulk of the kind of the caring responsibility. So they're time poor. So to invest in doing a job application actually takes a lot of time. In fact, someone I've interviewed recently describes it as having another full-time job on top of the caring responsibilities, her existing full-time job and other roles that she has, let alone having a life on top of that where, you get to go and sit in the park and read a book by yourself for a bit. I spend a lot of my time sitting on interview panels. One of the reasons for that is I'm now quite senior in my career, and I'm a woman, and I hold a role which has the word computing and business in the title, and still women are underrepresented in both those areas. So what happens is I get called in to sit on interview panels. And the last time I was called in to sit on an interview panel, the email subject heading was something to the effect of, "We need a woman." So nothing to do with my background, my expertise, my seniority, or indeed my experience of sitting on lots of interview panels, but simply, "Hey Maz, you're a woman. We've got this interview coming up. It'll be great if you could sit in on this." Now, I don't mind being approached to sit on interview panels. And I think it's great that when you walk into the room, if you've been selected for interview, you for sure want to see a diverse panel there. I think walking into a room and seeing, everyone the same would be pretty intimidating for anyone. But to do that as part of kind of a tick box exercise with sort of no thought about how that intersects with the job role, what's happening in terms of, how we frame the tone of the interview, what we're asking of our candidates. So one thing that one of the organizations I'm working with at the moment has done is to start to do like a 2-step system. So before, they were shortlisting off, you had to send in a piece of coding that you had done, GitHub, and also do the full application alongside that. So what they're doing now is you will have your GitHub requirements in terms of responding to a specific task. You won't be asked to do a full application until you've been shortlisted. Then you get to do your then you get to do the full application. And that saves a lot of time for candidates as well, because, a GitHub repository, particularly for those roles, for that organization, is something those kinds of candidates will already have or will already have experience of. Well, just a side note there, what's interesting and happening at the moment within the job market is we found within one of the organizations that candidates are coming forward who are faking it until they make it, I think is a polite way of putting it. So they're going,
I've never heard that before.
They're going onto sites like Fiverr.com or those kind of gig work sites and asking the task they've been set in terms of sending in their code, that they're asking someone else to do that for them and complete that task so they can get through to the next phase. Now, that's pretty easy to spot because generally you want candidates who have a good history of archiving and putting stuff onto GitHub. So if you've got an outlier who just has this one thing, it is easy to spot. But it's interesting to see what's going on behind the scenes in terms of people modifying their behavior or taking on new ways to kind of get around the system. And I think that just speaks to kind of a more serious set of problems around sort of what happens within that interview process anyway, in terms of the protocols and what's expected of candidates. I mean, something else that's fairly straightforward to do, but organizations tend to resist it, is to make sure that the times for interviews, that there's a choice. So if you have caring roles and responsibilities, that there's a time that's kind of within the traditional workday, and there's other times that are kind of more flexible, obviously giving the candidates the opportunity as well to do one part of the interview by Zoom or something else like that. I think the reason that organizations are resistant to those kinds of support mechanisms is that they cost money, because if you're bringing together a panel for a day's worth of interviews, that's one thing. But then if it's a day and then maybe an evening, a couple of days, that's actually quite expensive to do. So I can understand why there is resistance to those kinds of support mechanisms. But there are lots of things that people can do. Certainly if they are true to their word about courting particular groups of people to come into organizations that are underrepresented.
So far, we've been talking about companies and Fortune 500 and all of that. But what about academia? What's the situation there? I mean, we all like to think that academia is this noble set of institutions where everything is much better. Is it?
That's a good question. I think academia is probably where it's better in some respects, but then also more toxic in others. One reason for that is we've got researchers researching things like the culture of change, good leadership, advocacy. We are very good at identifying what the problems are and kind of the mechanisms and the routes through that in terms of methods of support and how we can really advocate for change. Where it gets more toxic and where there are more barriers is that the processes involved with that tend to be very long tail and involve many different people at many different levels. And if it isn't institution-wide, as in, implemented by the very senior management team, so the PBC and down, it tends not to happen. To give an example, the technical roles that we have within advanced research computing, where I am, trying to do is modify some of the words within the job adverts, because we know that does help appeal to different groups of people who we want to recruit into those kinds of roles. And simply having a sentence at the end of the job advert that says, we're particularly keen on X or Y group, doesn't really cut the mustard. So what we've been trying to do is to work with HR and find ways to really modify that text. One, make the job description shorter, so it's less intimidating from kind of a word cabbage point of view. And two, it's more focused around what we're really looking for in terms of the ideal candidate. So a simple sentence, something to the effect of, if you're someone who doesn't fulfill all the role requirements and responsibilities, we still want to hear from you, because it's about the whole cohesive background of your experience. And even if you don't have this particular program skill or whatever it is, we still want you there. We've been met with a lot of resistance from that internally, because it's a fight over what the template is for the job description, basically. So it becomes very complex. So something as simple as that suddenly has a lot of moving parts and a lot of people that need to be involved and signed off. And things generally move quite slowly within academic institutions as well.
We come probably to the discussion of checkbox ticking exercise a little bit later, because a lot of universities are signing up to diversity and inclusion. But then, as you say, the realization of that very often is hampered by bureaucracy and a big tanker, basically, that is very slow to turn around or change direction. So what is it that actually is being done? And could you give some examples where some positive change has happened?
Sure. People are now being very upfront about the data that they have and access to that data. So, for example, in my neck of the woods, we now have data that tells us what the gender pay gap is. And that is like a stab through the heart every time that annual report comes through.
Yeah.
Off the back of that, we now have people in senior leadership positions. So, for example, at Durham, there's a new PBC for EDI. So looking at equality, diversity and inclusion. And I would like to think that also includes equity, diversity and inclusion too. And that is a positive change, because it means that you have someone in post who is committed to and thinking about the complexity of those kinds of problems, and who you can go to and who would be an open ear. I think where the barriers still remain, however, is about the remit of those kinds of roles and actually what they can do, because you've got everything from very big problems such as the gender pay gap, right down to things as almost as straightforward as kind of the words on a job description. Again, it's very difficult to see that the mechanisms and processes involved in terms of how those two issues intersect is very obvious, but actually how those changes happen at an institutional level is still very opaque. On the positive side of things, there is an acknowledgement of the problem, which is great. So we're all now pointing at the elephant in the room, and that elephant is very much there. I think what we're not doing very effectively is any joined up thinking around sort of sustaining advocacy in terms of points of change. We've cottoned on to, maybe we should change how we should do recruitment. as kind of one area of focus, and that is an area of focus, and that has had sustained development and conversation and workshops and kind of remodeling around it within the internal comms team, but also in terms of the look and the style of the job adverts. But still, there are improvements that need to be made there. But we're not very good at sort of the afterthought in terms of, well, what about the existing staff? For example, within my institution, what has been refreshing in terms of positive change has been the new pockets of communities and groups of support that have started set up. So, for example, different groups around Black academics and Black researchers coming together at Durham, or you've got the Disability Support Network and other kind of groups of support. Now, that signals to me advocacy and community ethos and sharing, but also being a member of some of those groups, it's also therapy for the members within that for what I would call burping the lid. So you sort of have to build up a pressure around what the problems are. And it's very cathartic to share those with others who are...
I'm not alone, basically.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Yes. So I'm severely dyslexic. I have other sort of long-term chronic health conditions. So I'm part of the Disability Support Network. And within that, it's very nice to kind of share war wounds and horror stories about how that impacts your working life and professional life. But there is still agreement within those kinds of groups as well that there isn't enough change or enough support mechanisms within the current institutional structure, or even where to go to get support. And there's a lot of mistrust as well around who you can go to and who you would share certain kinds of information with. So, for example, I was not diagnosed with dyslexia until I was in my late 30s. And at the time, I was advised by the organization that did my diagnosis to be very careful about who I told in a professional capacity. So did I want my line manager to know? Think seriously about who I wanted to know amongst, my colleagues. And initially, I did take that on board, and that went quite deep. I sort of hid it, continued to hide it, was a bit worried that label was associated with me. It would somehow damage me, perhaps others. Maybe my students would be worried about that, having a dyslexic academic who was their lecturer, their module leader, whatever that was. I mean, now I'm completely open about it. We're talking about it. It's on the end of my email signature. I mean, yeah, it's there. So I'm not going to be ashamed about that anymore. But those kind of different points of support are fantastic in terms of the positive change. So there is advocacy, it is open, it's visible, which is something else I talk about in the book. It's important to have that visibility. But that visibility only goes so far. So it's happening within those groups, but it's not happening as a cohesive change to the work culture or sort of the institution as a whole, unfortunately, yet.
Thanks so very much for sharing all of that. Do you feel that kind of visibility is still lacking? Do you think that sharing stories like yours now is more the exception than the rule? Or is it that people are still finding it very difficult today to acknowledge that they might have a difference to other people, whether it's being dyslexia, whether it's other things?
It's a really good question. I think it depends on who you talk to and the framing of the context in which you're in. So to give an example, very recently, a colleague of mine held a group meeting to talk about research, but also sort of computational methods and routes of support around different projects for neurodiversity. And it was a really interesting session. It was only an hour, but my gosh, we could have gone all day. And what started out as the kinds of projects that we would be interested in doing and how we would run those ended up into a very cathartic sharing of some of the professional barriers, some of the intentions that we have as a community that is neurodiverse, the ways in which we want to think about things and how we can advocate for each other. And that felt very healthy, but that happened within that pocket of time. And those stories felt very listened to. What we didn't have was anyone in from the senior management team listening to us, taking on board what might need to change to support those different routes of support, those different ways of thinking, that mechanism for change. To give another example, I don't travel very much at the moment because I have a long-term health condition. When I'm invited to speak at things, I do the Zoom thing, and I was fortunate enough to be asked to contribute to a workshop that was going to be a 2-day long event where we talk about equity within complex organizations, leadership change. There was going to be about 50 of us. There's a bit of talk and chalk. But the main event through each session was going to be different breakout rooms, and then we come back together.
Mm-hmm.
We have kind of a collective sharing. And that was great, the first 2 hours. And then the most senior people in the room, who happened to be a couple of men, decided that after 2 hours they'd had enough and they left. There was sort of very tokenistic listening in, or helicopter listening, as I like to call it, where senior managers are aware that there are important stories and conversations happening. And it's not that they don't want to distance themselves. It's not that they don't think that they're not important, but they're time poor themselves. They come in when they can, and then they helicopter out. But they're not really there sufficiently immersed in what is happening or the needs of those particular communities to really understand advocacy and change there. So I think, to go back to your original question, I think those stories that we share are very important. I think there are degrees of perhaps discomfort sometimes, maybe even prejudice and bias about where those stories come from and what the attention of those stories are to do. Because often they come in within singular panel sessions of, well, let's have we're having a tech event. Let's make sure that we have a women in tech strand to that. And then we'll talk about all those issues in the women in tech strand. So that'll be like the problem bit. And then the rest of the event will do like all the other innovation stuff, the tech stuff. Yeah. It sort of sits as a bit of an outlier. I think the other issue is, and the more that I do this kind of research, the more people that I speak to, particularly senior leaders and executives and directors and CEOs, and typically they are older men, is a lot of them are fearful of making mistakes or worried about saying the wrong thing. Or I had someone very senior say to me when he was invited to a women leadership conference, say, "Oh, but that's not for me. I'm not a woman." And it took me to say, "Well, don't be ridiculous. This is a conference about advocating for women in leadership positions. You absolutely need to be there. Are you advocating for that? Or are you not?" And the penny dropped. He was like, "Oh, I am." It isn't a label that's designed to be excluding. It's designed to be doing the exact opposite. But as I talk about in the book, labels themselves have those kinds of problems, particularly when we band around the label women in tech, because it can, not always, but it can create that othering and make people feel othered or kind of fearful about whether they're included or not, and all those kinds of things.
You mentioned a number of things that I would like to home in a little bit more in the final part of our conversation today. And one was equity and equality. So, in fact, in your book, you're writing, today's women are colored by a dominant masculine tech culture that intensively ensures that the message of difference rather than equality is embedded. That kind of struck home with me because I think that's also the content of another book that I read recently, in the sense that we make visible diversity and we talk about inclusion, but what's missing in the equation actually is the equality, like equal pay, for instance, and the working conditions, making them so that women can feel safe and at home in the workplace just as the men do, and other minorities as well. Are we missing a trick here?
I think we are. I mean, one way I see this kind of most visibly, it feels most palpable, is looking at career progression and promotion. So we're treating it as equality, which means that everyone's treated exactly the same way, regardless of your differences. Within one of the tech organizations that I sort of have a long-term working relationship with, they're based in the UK, they're based in London. They're an education tech supplier. They do software, but also technical hardware as well. They would like more women to work for them, and they're working on that. And when we look to kind of the promotion rounds within the current organizational structure, particularly coming out of COVID, everything was the same for everyone. And the suggestion that was made was, well, maybe we should look at people who have been adversely hit by schools not being open or nurseries not being open, or who have had to look after elderly relatives or themselves are long-term sick. And when we did that and took that into context, then that was really eye-opening, because we're dealing with equity then in terms of the support that needed to come in to get people further up the career ladder, meaning that everyone was kind of provided with what they needed to succeed, taking into account the very complex intersection of life and work as happened in the pandemic. Then they realized that they had sort of more people currently within the organization, particularly women, who were promoted. And they took that one step further as well in terms of when they were pushing for recruitment. So they had a series of job ads that went out that they had the usual
Mm.
spiel about we're particularly interested in people from sort of minority groups, women, etc., etc. An extra sentence to signal that, if you have been adversely hit by conditions within the pandemic, so sort of long-term sickness leave,
Mm.
bereavement, whatever it is, that will absolutely be taken into account and won't go against sort of your experiences or periods of kind of being out of work or whatever it is that you have had to do, and also be taken into account as well within the organization. So how quickly you go into a full-time role, for example, so you could start part-time, but also the need for greater flexibility, which is becoming more common. So hybrid working, working from home, all those kinds of things, and having something that's much more kind of project and goal orientated rather than kind of mandatory hours set by your employer.
Mm.
And it's becoming increasingly important that we recognize that difference between equality and equity and what is happening. It doesn't have to be sort of very complex, large-scale tech organizations, even within small, even micro SMEs, with regards to how that workforce is created, how it is sustained, how it's motivated, what the work conditions actually are, and how we recognize work culture, which traditionally has been away from the home, unless it's been a cottage industry. And then it's been very separate from caring roles and domestic labor. And that simply isn't the case anymore. We've got some wonderful research coming out at the moment. I've just read it in the British Journal of Management, which was looking at sort of adverse impact of COVID on senior professional women, and some amazing data there around what they were doing within the pandemic to kind of take on board homeschooling, caring responsibilities, domestic labor within the home, but also still working full time. I have direct experience of that myself. Like, I remember trying to teach students while I had my then 5-6-year-old next to me, trying to entertain her with Lego. I mean, luckily, because that was kind of a very unusual set of circumstances, unusual event, everyone was pretty sympathetic to when you appeared on Zoom and you had sort of
Mm.
little people around you or you had to make a phone call. But it was a real privilege in that moment to have extra space within the home where I have a home office. Not everyone has that. People were literally on their kitchen tables. And so again, this goes back to your original question around what equality, equity truly means for people as we go
Yeah.
forward, and how that really impacts work culture, because it does.
You mentioned the senior manager because, I agree that in an organization, whether it's academia or whether it's the private sector, there needs to be someone at the top who actually also gives the direction and saying, well, this is where we're going. Doesn't mean that it happens on the ground. But from what you're saying is there's the helicopter moment, right? So we fly into discussion on diversity and inclusion. And I've experienced that firsthand in the company that I used to work for, where this happened, where the CEO dropped in for 5 minutes, but then actually nothing happened afterwards. So how can we work with senior managers in academia and in the industry, of course, to bring about real change?
One of the ways I've started to do this is to really change my mindset around where change happens. So in my research, I've started to identify not only what the mechanisms of EDI, DEI are, but who actually does that. And it's usually, if it's in a large-scale organization, policies are sort of generally agreed upon within senior management teams, but the actual people who carry them out, if you're very lucky, there will be one or two or a small group of people charged with EDI stuff. So they'll have an EDI remit within that organization. More often than not, that person or those people do not exist. Then it's down to human resources. So HR are in charge of enacting those policies. So for example, the job template or the job ad, or looking at promotion policies and making sure that that is sort of fairly treated and so on. And then it goes very cold. The trail, it kind of stops. You've got this massive disconnect between what's happening at the top in terms of people in the leadership positions. They do know about the problems. They are sympathetic up to a point. They do seem to want to advocate for change, but there's almost a naivety about how that will happen. It's like, well, we have this policy now. Well, then we have solved that bias, that prejudice, that discrimination. And they don't really think about the intent behind that policy. So who is going to carry it out? I had this wonderful interview the other day with the COO within one of the tech organizations and was talking about their recent initiative, which was around advocacy. And I asked the question, well, whose day job is this? And they sort of gave an answer, well, it's everyone. We advocate for each other. And I'm like, but what does that mean? So explain to me, just give me an example. You get up, you check your email, you grab a coffee. When are you doing the advocacy? It's kind of like a state of mind. And it's like, but that's not good enough because a state of mind doesn't affect the change that you need. So let's take 1 point of difference. I don't know, the gender pay gap. How is you thinking about being an advocate helping anyone? Like, do you have a mentorship program? Oh, that's a good idea. We should do that. It's like, yeah, you really should do that. And then I asked the question, who's going to do the mentorship program? It's like, oh, I hadn't thought. It's like, yeah, because every time there's a policy or a change or a point of advocacy, people have to do that work. That's additional work. That's additional labor, which is why I think you're starting to see, and I'm seeing this more and more in my research, there seems to be pockets of resistance because change is scary and change is unfamiliar. But also some of this change comes with a time associated with it in terms of targets or benchmarks to hit by a certain date. And the way that we're currently doing that is we're grabbing around in the dark and turning on the light switch intermittently with these online training workshops, bias training and advocacy training. And you'll do an online workshop and that will be your requirement for the year. I've just done one for my organization. It means I'm covered for the next 12 months for diversity training. But that's not me advocating for anyone. That's not me tackling the gender.
That's checkbox ticking.
That is in its most pointless form ever. But it does mean that organization legal teams and sort of HR can roll back on, but we are doing diversity because look, 99% of our workers have done this diversity training and they've ticked this box and we know what diversity means. That's not good enough. Where I've started to shift the lens of my research is not to look at the problem anymore. I think we're all a bit bored of what the problem is. I've started to look at the who does the actual change within these organizations. Who is it?
And does anybody actually do it?
Yeah, exactly. Or do we just, sit in our ivory towers and go, oh, I should think about advocacy. That's nice.
We're coming to the end now. I think we could go on for quite some time because I still haven't covered a number of questions today. But I think we're running out of time now. But if you were to write the book in about 5 years' time, what do you hope to put in there?
Because I know where the skeletons in the closet are with that book in terms of where I wish it would have gone.
But you're not going to reveal that now, are you?
Yeah. What I really want to do is write something that's more practitioner-based. So in 5 years' time, I would like to join the dots between, all right, this diversity policy over here joins to this set of practices within the organization led by who, identify who those people are, and here is the difference, to actually map that out. I think that would be really powerful. We fall down in really joining the dots, really kind of spoon feeding our audience, spoon feeding perhaps not the right term, hammering home to our readership about what needs to happen and when, and what will be the effect of those points of change, those kinds of different policies, the efforts of the people, the who actually put in the change. You can probably tell I'm already thinking about writing that book.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope you will. And I think it boils down to we have to put our money where our mouths are.
For sure.
Well, let me just thank you for your time today. I think that was a very good conversation that we had about a very important subject that gets talked about a lot, like we did today, but more needs to be done.
We can both agree on that, for sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
If you'd like to get involved, there are diversity initiatives in a number of organizations. For instance, the Society for Research Software Engineering in the UK has a working group on the subject, as do other organizations. And Jeremy and Roland regularly advertise events of the Diverse series on Slack, so look out for that one. And finally, I'd like to thank the Jülich Research Center in Germany, the Forschungszentrum Jülich, for sponsoring this episode. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.